that we have a signal. Uh, as I said a moment ago, and I think I said last week, I'm going to jump all over the place. I've got a list of scriptures I'm looking at that I'm sort of pulling from. And the idea was, last week I mentioned how we'd gone through the law, and then we talked about Jesus' stance on the law. And so now I'm going to go a little bit further past that in understanding not just the law, but if you remember, I told you your homework assignment was to think about how you prepare to meet God and how you ready yourself for that encounter with the living God. And that's sort of where I'm going to go today, because I want us to think about God. And we have all kinds of titles that we use, but we don't always stop to think, what do they mean? We just mentioned folks in prayer. For those at home, we just mentioned, matter of fact, Mary, we just mentioned you. She's with us. But also Mike and Diane and Davis and Jim and other folks that, you know, just remember them in prayer. I did want to say a little something. Of course, I don't know if they're there. Last night I was in Lenoir, North Carolina, and I met with a bunch of old friends from high school. And mostly it was football players, and we got together. And if they're listening this morning, I wanted to say thank you to them for a wonderful evening. And it was great because we had to relive the past, of course, and tell our stories. Some were even true. But then we talked about the present. I thought it was interesting how one fellow works with the FCA, and he was talking about how kids today, he gives a message of ethics, morals, and integrity. And he said it's just sad to see how most of them have never heard those terms. And so we talked about the present and then we talked about our future, of course. Most of us are getting up there in years, so it's like, I hope we have a future. But it was interesting how meeting with a bunch of old football players turned into almost a church service for a minute there, as we talked about God who blessed us. And we talked about all the times we could have died, should have died, and yet God kept us going for some reason. So, like I said, some of them are probably watching or will be watching today. They told me they watch it afterwards. So I thought, well, that's even more than I thought. But again, thank you to those guys and their wives who are with us. Now today I want you, and like I said, I'm going to jump you around, but I want you to turn to 1 Corinthians chapter 13, which is called the love chapter. But there's a verse in there that's not necessarily about love, but it's one of those, what I call enigma verses. It makes you think, and oftentimes we run through it way too fast. But it's in chapter 13, it's verse 12. Now, y'all are familiar with this chapter because they read it at weddings and stuff. You know, they'll speak with the tongues of men and of angels and have not love. It's a great wedding passage. But down at the bottom, he's closing that passage out, and he said, when I became a man, I gave up childish ways. And before that, he said, I spoke as a child, I thought as a child, and I reasoned like a child, and then I became a man. In that verse, when he says that when I was a child, I spoke like a child, and I reasoned like a child. And when I became a man, I gave up childish ways. When I think about that, I thought he's basically saying that he matured. And in his maturity, he changed. You know, we as kids, and I love to do this with Harper because that little girl's smart as a whip. And we'll start talking about things. And she has a kid's logic. I think hers is better than most, though, because she thinks through things. But I remember as a child, we would see things and we'd go through our reasoning, our logical process as a child. But when we got older, we understood things at a much deeper level. That's what he's saying. But he's talking about spiritual maturity also. As a new convert, he was confused. Some people aren't aware that, we talk about Paul on the Damascus Road, and then he went and Ananias healed his blindness. And in one of the writings, it makes it appear that Paul immediately went there and then headed out looking for other disciples, and eventually went to Jerusalem and wasn't accepted. But one of the one of the writings tells that he went to Saudi Arabia for 3 years, and we forget about that. It's like the missing years of Paul, you might say. I think somebody ought to research it, but I don't know how you do it, because he didn't say anything about what happened in Saudi Arabia, other than the fact that he alludes to the fact that he went there to sort of get his head together. And here's a guy who had been really one of the foremost students in Jerusalem as a scholar. He studied with Gamaliel, who was the foremost teacher. And we see his name pop up sometimes when they're discussing what to do about Christians. And Gamaliel's the one who uses common sense. He said, gentlemen, if this is of God, we can't stop it. And if it's not, it'll probably die out on its own, which that's true. That had already happened. There have been plenty of messiahs, but they didn't last because they weren't of God. But he put that before. Now, that didn't stop the Sanhedrin, because they had an agenda, and their agenda was to get rid of Christians and to erase the thought of Christ. Ironically, what they did was actually spread Christianity, because when they stamped the Christians out of Jerusalem, they spread all over the place. And so then they had to send people out to try to confuse, and they lied about the teaching of Jesus. And Paul alludes to the fact that people were following it. He said, if someone else comes, don't listen to them if they're teaching something that I didn't teach. So we know that when the missionaries went out, Peter and Paul and Barnabas and Luke and Timothy, when they started going out, that men from the Sanhedrin would come to the Jewish communities and say, well, here's the truth. We also had people, that's not talked about a lot, but there were Gnostics who were coming in saying, here's what they didn't teach you. And so in the early days of Christianity, there was a lot of confusion, because Satan and the Sanhedrin were trying to put an end to it. But today, if you talk to agnostics, and if you talk to scholars, quote scholars, they will tell you that because of that, what we have in the Bible is not trustworthy. That amid all that confusion, everything got jumbled up and the message is messed up. And so how do you know the Bible is true? It's probably not. It was probably written, most of them are saying now that it was probably written in the 4th century, not even the 1st. I was surprised the other day. I was watching a show and there was a scholar that I had usually trusted, and he said, well, we know that the Bible wasn't written in the 1st century. And I thought, how do we know that? Simple question. How do you know the Bible wasn't written in the 1st century? You make that statement, everybody believes it, but you can't prove it, because there's as much evidence to suggest it was written in the 1st century than to suggest it was written later. And this was one of the things I studied a lot, because when I first heard that, I was concerned. So I started to look, is it the words used? Is it the stuff like that? And there are some new words in here. That's to be expected. There's some references to things that didn't come about until later. So there's some things that we might find that additions, but the biggest criticism most people have was the earliest we can set these would be Mark, thinking that Mark probably wrote about 20 years after the crucifixion. And people said, why didn't they write right away? That proves it was, actually what that proves is what the Bible says, because the prevailing attitude in the 1st century was Christ was coming back soon. And they preached that for a long time. Paul was one of the first who began to realize that our soon and God's soon are not the same. And he quotes Isaiah on that. And people understand, because he'll say, in Isaiah it says, 1,000 years of the Lord is like a single day. I thought, okay, we're on a different framework. The thing that struck me about that, and let's throw this in, is that's so close to Einstein's theories, that if you travel for a single day at the speed of light towards space, you'll go 1,000 years on Earth in a day at the speed of light. And I thought, interesting, that formula is the same as what Isaiah said. So it's like there's continuity, and we proved it with the laws of physics, that 1,000 years with God at the speed of light 1,000 years is like a single day with God. Anyway, So I wanted to touch on that, and we could spend all day talking about when the Bible's written, what are the proofs, and you'll still not convince people because in their mind they need to have it written in the 4th century so it can be full of errors. I've looked at it just from my own standpoint, studying it, and I see the argument, but I don't think it's as strong as saying the Bible was written in the 1st century by the people who said it was written. You know, they've got all kinds of crazy things, like there were 2 James. One wrote it and one didn't. One was a disciple, the one who wrote it. There was 2 Matthews. One that was a disciple, one that wrote the book of Matthew. And I thought, well, that's very convenient. If you can't prove it, just invent somebody. So anyway, in this text right here, Paul is talking about maturing in Christ, but he's also talking about comparing to physical maturing. And then he says in verse 12, he says, "For now we see in a mirror dimly, but then face to face. Now I know in part, then I shall know fully, even as I have been fully known." There's an interesting thing about this that you might have missed. We look at this thing, well, what is he saying? Paul is saying that just like I grew up from a child's reasoning to an adult reasoning, I understand God a little right now. But later, I'll understand him even more. But the thing that really puzzles me that nobody ever talks about, did you see it? Did you see something there that hurt your curiosity? Read that verse again. And don't go far.
Face to face.
No? I mean, that's interesting. But the thing that perked my curiosity is he says, now we see in a mirror. Oh, a mirror. How do we see God in a mirror? You know, it's like when I look in the mirror, I don't see God. Trust me. Usually I see a man with messed up hair, what little hair he has left. But then he says, see through a mirror dimly. How many of you know what a mirror was like in the 1st century? Anybody know what a mirror was?
Dingy.
Most of those mirrors that they used were polished bronze. And so you're not looking in a glass, even though they called it glass. It was polished bronze. And so you get, depending on how smooth the bronze is, you might get a Ripley face. You might get a golden face, probably. But it would be blurred. Because even though they polished bronze, only the very, very wealthy people could polish it to a fine reflective sheen. And even then, you're going to get a golden thing. People who had a mirror, sometimes it's just a little cheap mirror that you bought in the market, and it was just enough to give you a reflection, to trim a beard or something. And mirrors were not a big deal, by the way, because Jewish women were not so set on their appearance. It's usually the wealthy people. The Romans were big into it. You would get a better reflection looking into a pool of water than a mirror. But he says, now we look through a mirror dimly. And I think he puts that in there for purpose that he knew that when you look in a mirror, you don't really get a true image of what you're looking at. You get a distortion. And so now we see God through a distorted view. Why? Because we're not mature enough to understand God. And that message Paul talks a lot about. And I think it's because he was a scholar and a teacher. Because as a teacher, when you're preparing lessons, and trust me, I hated lesson plans. We had to prepare lesson plans for every class and for every lesson and turn them into the principal, knowing full well that they never looked at them. Unless they were trying to get you in trouble. Then they'd look at it and come to your classroom and say, where are you in your lesson plan? And I was like, well, I finished that a year ago. I actually went to a weekend clinic in Winthrop. We had to go learn this year's lesson plan format. And it was the most terrible experience of my life. We sat there, all these teachers, talking about how we're going to put our lesson plan together. And we had got a form we had to follow. We did it and went back. And I saw the principal. I said, I'm doing the new form. She said, I don't like the new form. Do the old form. I said, but I've already done the new form. She said, I'll take it. And I thought, yeah, because you're not going to look at it anyway. But South Carolina is a headache because they change forms like every other year. And it's just such an exercise in futility because if you're a good teacher, you have a plan, but you're also fluid because things may change in the course of that lesson. You've got to gauge it to the children and their interest. If you just, and there are some teachers that follow the lesson plan. They're the ones that have to wake their kids up when the bell rings. But he's saying here that we don't see things clearly. And like a teacher who's trying to teach us, God is trying to teach us, we're having trouble with our lesson plan because we don't know the whole lesson. And Paul in particular, if you study just the letters of Paul, you'll find this a theme that he's really wanting you to know God better. Now, the Gospels are telling you all about Jesus, and it's almost like they assume you know that because they weren't writing so much for the future. They were writing their memories of the past and sharing it with others. Luke is the best at that because his purpose in writing his gospel was not for people who had seen it, but for Theophilus who had not seen anything. So he's a little more detailed and a little more exacting about this I write to you, Theophilus, you'll see his name, and he explains things. Mark is like a reporter for the Gazette. He's trying to get as much said in as little words as possible. So his is the shortest gospel. And yet, it's pretty clear that Mark didn't see all this stuff. We estimate that Mark was about 13 when he first encountered Jesus. And it was at Mark's house where they had the Last Supper. And Mark's probably the person who snuck off to the garden and heard Jesus' prayer. And I can talk about that some other time, but where did Mark get all this information? It's assumed it's Peter, because Peter didn't write a gospel, which confused people. I thought, here's the rock that we build the church on. He didn't even write the story. Well, he did write it, but not from our viewpoint. Mark wrote it. But Peter was probably dictating to Mark. Mark may have been asking questions, or either that, or Peter sat down and said, write this down. And then it was quick. Well, Matthew looked at Mark's writing and wrote his gospel and added stuff for Jews. Luke looked at Mark's gospel and added his stuff for Theophilus. John wasn't even around and didn't look at Mark's gospel. And so when you look at the three gospels, we call them the synoptic gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, because there's so much alike with added material in Matthew and Luke. But John is totally out there. John is the theological gospel. But then you come back, none of them are really preparing us to meet God because they'd already met God. Paul sees a necessity to prepare you. And the first thing he says here, and I'm just picking this as first, by the way, is we've got to mature because we're seeing God like a child, an innocent eyes. But we will later see him as an adult, and we've got to reason through this. And if he's the one that presses this. At another spot in his writings, he says, you had the milk, it's time for the meat, using the example of babies drink milk, adults eat meat. And the gospel of Jesus can be served as milk, but you've got to get to the meat of it. And he said, you got to dig into this, because Paul was more, I guess you'd say, interested in the theology. I used to work with a girl. She was a teacher, and she was just great, very good Christian girl. We'd have these conversations, but she would make some sweeping general statements, and I said, you got to be careful of that. She said, why? I said, well, you're sort of mixing the theology, or you miss the theology. And she gets so mad at me. She said, all I hear from you is theology, theology, theology. I want to talk about Jesus. I said, that's what we're talking about. But so many people, when they think theology, they think, that don't matter. I'm not going to do that. I want to talk about the Bible. The Bible is a theological book. And what does theology mean? Anybody know? It's one of those ology words, which study of God, theos. Theology is the study of God. And so we should be studying God. Why? Because Paul says it's better to know who you're going to be meeting to spend an eternity with than just walk up cold. You ever gone to somebody's house you didn't know? Imagine you go to God's house and they ring the doorbell and you just walk in and say, I'm here now. those people are going to kick you out. You know, I'm that person who, and Debbie was with me, so I'll bring her in on this. We'd ride around one day and we'd look at houses, and we saw this beautiful house. So I pulled up to the door. She said, "What are you doing?" I said, "Ain't nobody here. I'm going to check it out." It was in the building process. She said, "You can't do that." I said, "If the door's open, I can." In I go. And she is sheepishly following me. I mean, they were still doing construction, you know, the walls and the windows, some of them were up, some were not. I thought, they're building, you know, they don't mind. So I just want to look around. So I'm looking around, you know, and she is like hiding behind me. She said, "We're going to get caught." I said, "But all we're doing is looking. Maybe we want to buy this house." Well, a few minutes later, I heard this voice says, "Can I help you?" I said, "Oh, somebody's in the house." It was the builder. He'd come by to check on it. I said, "Just looking at this house." I said, "You know who built it?" He said, "I am building it." I said, "Ooh," I said, "You going to sell it?" He said, "I'm going to live in it." I thought, well, it's getting better and better. But after a while, he sort of calmed down. You know, and he said, "Now, I'm doing this." He said, "I've got 2 more down the street that I've built, and I got one over here." He started telling us where all his houses were. He said, "You ought to go back and look at them." I said, "Well, yeah, we will." I mean, it's a beautiful house. It's up off 200 near Waxhaw. But the builder, the owner, wasn't ready for me because he didn't know me and I didn't know him. Now, use that analogy with God. You're going to God's house. Do you know him well enough to walk right in? Does he know you well enough to let you in? That's always a big worry. Now, the good news is that through the grace of Christ, we're going to get in. The bad news is that once we're in, what are we going to do? We're going to spend half of eternity getting to know God when we're supposed to spend our whole life getting to know God. And do we? Last week I said we need to think in terms of setting priorities. As a Christian, I told you my little testimony about how I was going to be an opera singer and all that stuff, and I thought, no, if I deal with life, I've got to deal with it realistically. And I know I said something last week that I probably shouldn't, because God called me to the ministry, and I went. God doesn't call everybody to the actual ministry. Every one of you has a ministry, and that is to be a witness. But he's not saying, "Debbie, where's your church? You should be preaching this morning." He might not have called you to be a pastor or a deacon or whatever. But God calls everyone to the ministry of witnessing. That's the Great Commission. For me, it was a call to be in the church ministry, which I mixed up. I should have gone into pastor to begin with. But I don't regret the years I spent doing music and youth and senior adult ministry. But God called me to that. But the point is, that became the priority in my life. And in one church I served, it bothered people a little bit, because it's like, "Well, you seem to have your priorities set on something else other than church." I said, "I do." I said, "My priority is God. It should be your priority too." They didn't like that. Church should have the priority of God. Everything we do should be theos-centered. If it's not, then we become a social club. And I know it's good for us to be social and get together, but I worry about that. That sometimes we're so busy trying to be happy in the world that we're not preparing ourselves for the next life. And to that comment, let's go somewhere else. Turn to Colossians. While you're turning, I'm going to read you a verse that you all know, but it's important in our understanding of understanding God. You've heard Philippians 2:5. You've heard it in the King James Version, which, by the way, is my favorite. I'm reading from the ESV, though, so I'll do both. In the ESV, Philippians 2:5 says, "Complete my joy by being the same mind, having the same love, being in full accord with one mind." Now, if you don't recognize that, King James says, "Let this mind be in you, which was in Christ Jesus." Paul is saying, we've got to have the mind of Christ if you want to understand God. That's a tall order, because the mind of Christ is the mind of God. So how do we have the mind of Christ? Well, fortunately, over in Colossians in chapter 3, we get a few hints. Well, first in chapter 2, Colossians chapter 2. says, "For I want you to know how great a struggle I have for you, and for those at Laodicea, and for all who have not seen me face to face." That would be us too. "That their hearts may be encouraged, being knit together in love, to reach all the riches of full assurance and understanding." And here's the meat of it. "And the knowledge of God's mysteries, which is Christ, in whom are hidden all the treasures of wisdom and knowledge." So there we have a hint. We're looking for something. We're on a treasure hunt, and we're trying to solve a mystery. Now, the treasure hunt and the mystery are wisdom and knowledge. Well, we think, well, I went to college to get smarter. Okay. If you went to a trade school, you learn that trade so that you can do that trade, and that trade becomes very important in your life. If you go to college, the same thing. You have a major, and that major becomes your focus, whether it be engineering or nursing, or for me it was music. The sad thing is I was a music major. It prepared me, and I asked the teacher one day, I said, "What can I do with this major?" He said, "You can sing," because I was majoring in voice. I said, "I can do that anyway." I said, "But what am I going to do when I get out of college? I'm going to have a job." He said, "Will you be a professional singer?" I said, "What if I'm not? What if I fail? I need something to fall back on." He said, "We'll switch your major to music education. Then you can be a teacher." I said, "That makes sense." So I switched, and in doing so, I added a year to my college life. But I got a degree in music education, where they were teaching me how to teach music. And then I could be a professional singer, or I could fail at that and become a music teacher. So that was my focus. Later, I was in the ministry, and I thought, okay, I'm using my music in the ministry, but I'm also trying to serve God. What can I do? And it was about that time, I've told you this before, but I went to Africa, and I felt like God was saying, "I need you to speak. I need you to talk. I need you to preach." And I had felt God's call to the ministry in Guatemala, and in Africa, I felt God's call to the pastorate. So I came back, and I thought, how do I prepare myself? And so I went to divinity school, which, don't get confused. Divinity school and seminary are exactly the same thing. It's just divinity school is attached to a college, seminary stands alone. People don't always understand that. So I went to divinity school, and they asked me, they said, "What do you want to do?" I said, "I felt a call to preach." They said, "Well, you can do 2 tracks. You can get an MRE or you can get an MDiv. I said, "What is that?" "Master of Religious Education, and you can be a preacher." I said, "Okay. What's the MDiv?" "Master of Divinity, and you can be a preacher." I said, "What's the difference?" MRE is 36 hours. You can do it 2 years. I said, "Oh, that sounds good." "What's the MDiv?" "It's 98 hours. I said, "What? I've already done a degree like that." I said, "What's the difference?" He said, "Well, MRE is your basic homiletics and some theology, New Testament, Old Testament, and some preaching. That's it." I said, "What's over here?" He said, "Over here is everything. You've got to do homiletics, of course, which nobody knows these words means. You've got all kinds of big word courses." And then he said, "Plus you have your languages. You got to do Hebrew and Greek." And he made it sound like you've got to do it. I said, "That's what I want." He said, "Why?" I said, "Well, I want to read the Bible in Hebrew and Greek." He said, "Well, there's only a Master of Divinity." And so I did a Master of Divinity. And I thought, I'm going to be 4 years. I don't know if it was my eagerness or God's willingness, but I did it in 3 years. And to this day, I had a lady come to me once. She was a member of the church. She said, "How are you doing what you do?" I said, "What do you mean?" She said, "You're here at the church all day. You're with the kids all night," because I was doing youth ministry and we were very active. She said, "You're doing the senior adults on the weekend, taking them all over the world. When do you do your schoolwork?" I said, "I have a little cubby hole where I have a computer, and I go there and I do it all night." She said, "When do you sleep?" I said, "Actually, I get about 2 hours sleep a night." I did that for 3 years. And I look back on it and I thought, how did I do that? It was like I had the energy. I drove an hour over to Gardner Webb, where the divinity school was. And I drove back, and I would go there at different times. Sometimes you had to be there 3 days a week, sometimes 5 days a week. And so I'd take my mornings from work, go over there, come back, be at the church all afternoon and that evening. And I thought, that was a bit of a miracle. But before I start talking about how great I am, God gives you the goal and he gives you the energy to complete it. Because when I was finished, I needed a nap. But I did that work. And because I think God's plan for me is to do this, and my plan is to know God. And so here I was, looking for this. And the crazy thing is, divinity did not teach me the mystery, or did it give me the wisdom and knowledge I was looking for. And I thought, well, wait a minute, where do you get that? And I came back studying the Bible, and here's the big secret I'm going to tell you. You don't always get that in school, because this is something from God. Notice he says, reach the fullness of the assurance of understanding and the knowledge of God's mystery, and he gives us the answer, which is Christ. You got to know Jesus. And that's hard to do because you don't live around here. It's a personal relationship, and that's what Paul is saying. You need a personal relationship with God. And since Christ is no longer on the earth, what do we have? It is a spiritual relationship. Now, here's the cool thing about Colossians. He gives us an idea of how to do it. Down at the bottom of chapter 2, around verse 18, he mentions a couple of things. He says, let no one disqualify you, and it's by insisting on asceticism, the worship of angels, going on in detail about visions, puffed up with reason by a sensuous mind, and not holding fast to the head, from whom the whole body is nourished in it. The head is Christ. What he's saying, and he's talking to these Colossians, he said, look out, don't waste your time with the distractions. Well, I didn't read that verse. I spent a lot of time with the distractions because I wanted to understand what it is that's distracting people. For a while in my career, I considered myself an apologetic, and what that is someone who looks at the other argument and tries to understand the other argument so that you can undercut it. It's a debate tactic. So I like to debate people. I would argue with a fence post if it took the opposite position of what I had. And as Christians, we need some of that, but we can get lost in that. That's what Paul's saying. Because asceticism, how many of you know what asceticism is? Big word, we don't use it a whole lot, but it was big in the first century. An asceticism is doing physical things to draw yourself closer to God. Sadly, most ascetic practices are self-torture. In the first century, and even today, particularly in the Roman Catholic Church, they have asceticism. We don't talk about it a whole lot because it's considered very private. I say we have, I don't have it. Most commonly, they use a thing called the chalice, which comes in different shapes. It can be it looks like a dog collar with spikes on the inside. And they'll wrap it around their arm or around their leg, or they'll get one that goes all the way around their body. And it's metal with spikes, and it's put on, and you tighten it to where they pierce the skin. And then you walk around in it all day long. The monks still today, in some cultures, practice they call it things like flagellation, immolation. They take whips, and as they pray, they beat themselves with whips. They take their shirt off. They beat themselves till the blood comes. That's asceticism. I think it was Antioch, they had a famous, his name was Simon. He had a pillar, and he took off his clothes all the way down to his underwear, and he was just, naked basically. He sat up on that pillar and sat there. His witness was, see that as Christ was lifted up, naked, exposed to the elements on the cross, I am naked, exposed to the elements, and I suffer like Jesus. He didn't come down, ever. He didn't eat, he didn't drink, he could hardly sleep up there, he'd fall off. And people admired him because he was torturing himself so that they brought him food and water, and they gave him a bucket for the bathroom stuff. But he stayed up there till he died. And it's like, what a devout Christian. But the question is, how did he really serve Christ? he was a witness, but a rather odd witness. The stories of the Catholic Church are full of ascetic practices. Francis of Assisi, you remember him? Everybody thinks Francis is so great. Francis bled to death. He had the stigmata of his hands and feet, but he didn't want to be bandaged up, so he bled to death and died. The last person who had the stigmata was a Catholic priest who, he was rather old, and he bled to death. They thought it was a pleasure that God would kill them in that way. Now doctors say that the stigmata is probably a mental condition where people want it so bad that they manifest it in their hands and their feet. But who knows? It's a mystery. Paul is saying, don't do that. That doesn't serve God at all. And it's like, you know the Marine motto? This is probably so way off for a Sunday school lesson, but it's the Marines have a great motto that fits. And a Marine, I was working with the military, and this Marine told me one time, he said, all that hero stuff, that's important. He said, but it's our job not to die for our country, but to make them die for theirs. And I thought, well, that makes sense, you know. And it's sort of like God is saying, I don't want you to die for me as much as I want you to live for me. And we will die, because if you live for Christ, the world's coming after you. But God says, live for me. How can we be a witness if we're dead? You know, people who are martyrs, they are doing it in the process of trying to live for Christ. That's another thing we miss, because some people say, oh, I want to be a martyr. I'm going to throw myself in this pit of vipers. No, you'll be a martyr. If you live for Christ, you may get martyred, because people will hate you. In this day, if you stood for Christ, people would come get you and you die. But that's a whole lot different than basically trying to kill yourself and call yourself a martyr. I don't say prophesy, I'll say predict. But I think we're going to see more martyrs coming. Do you know that there are more people martyred today than were martyred in the first century? Now you think, what? It's simply because there are more Christians today in more cultures that are anti-Christian. So there are a lot of people being killed. And we don't hear about it. Why? Well, for one, the news don't want to tell about it. Political statement, 3, 2, 1. The news is antichrist. It is against God. It doesn't want you to think about God. Everything we see today is basically undermining God. Now, if you disagree, that's fine. You can tell me I'm wrong, but just from my observation, it seems to be, because you catch the news in more lies than you do news. So that tells me that something's going on. I go back to 2 Thessalonians, where it says they will hate the truth. I thought, we're seeing that today. So anyway, we're trying to find something. Now, how do we find it? Here's where Colossians is good. It says, avoid asceticism and the worship of angels. By the way, do you know who does asceticism? I just told you, actually. Roman Catholics. There are some Pentecostals that do it. They get a little wild and crazy. And there's some really crazy people, the ones that drink cyanide and handle snakes. I'm not for that. But that's anything you do that potentially harms you and you say you're doing it for God, that's asceticism. Now, who worships angels? You know any angel worshipers? There's only one church I know that makes it an integral part of their teachings and their practice, and that's the Mormon Church. The Mormon Church was founded by a visitation by an angel. Moroni visited Joseph Smith in his bedroom and said, let me take you out here and show you the secret scriptures that have been buried for thousands of years. And that's the beginning of Mormonism. And they still have a big thing. They go to the temple, and a friend of mine was a Mormon, and he left. He and I, we argued for years. And then one year I went to visit his sister who was getting married, and he was there, and he came up and he shook my hand. He said, you were right. I said, about what? He said, about the church. I said, did you leave? He said, yeah. He said, I'm no longer a Mormon. He said, because they lied to me. I about fell over, because I thought, I've been praying for this guy forever. And what he told me, though, I said, tell me what happens, because you would never tell me what happened. I said, but one day you told me you had an experience in the temple. Can you tell me about it? He said, Brooks, I'll be honest with you, I'm still a little shy about talking about that. He said, but I'll tell you what happens. He said, We go to the temple for our endowments, and we sit in a hallway, and we're told to wait until we have a epiphany with God. I said, what is it? He said, almost every one is the visitation of an angel. I said, did you have it? He said, I did. He said, and what's more, in that hallway, in that temple, I saw angels coming down through the ceiling and going to other people. I said, okay, you sure it wasn't a hallucination? He said, what I think it was demons in the guise of angels. And I about freaked out because I thought, I knew some weird stuff was going on in the temple. They won't talk about it. But I didn't know it was that actual. And so people, they say, oh, that's just a bunch of hooey. There's no spirits floating through the ceiling and stuff. I thought, well, maybe in Mormonism. But anyway, that's going on. Now, they were doing it back then, the worship of angels, but it was not the kind of angels we think of. It was really demons too, because they did it in Mithraism. I about forgot what it was, which was bull worship, blood worship, and people thought Mithraism was Christianity because they would use the term, we've been washed in the blood, and Christians were saying that too, talking about Jesus' sacrifice. So there's a lot of confusion, but he goes on, he says, and going on in detail about visions, puffed up with reason by the sensuous mind. In other words, these were the Gnostics he's talking about there. The Gnostics were people who went around who thought they knew more than anybody. And so when it came to Christians, they said, God has given us a special knowledge. Gnostic means knowledge. Gnosis, I should say, means knowledge. So if you're a Gnostic, you're someone who thought they had special wisdom, and they were puffed up. They thought they were smarter than everybody else. And guess what? They still exist today. Gnosticism may be one of the oldest religions in the world because there were Gnostics before there were Christians. There were Gnostics during the time of Babylon when the Jews were sent there. And it was these people with special knowledge. Some people trace it all the way back and say, well, this was the beginning of the Masons. You know, they were Gnosticism. Some say it's the Illuminati, they're Gnostics. All kinds of stuff, which Masons are a strange thing because at one point Baptists criticized Masons. When they found out a lot of Christians were Masons, they gave more money than everybody else. They quit criticizing them. So I thought, well, that worked out pretty good. The only thing about Masons is twofold. If they are a subversive group, they do a lot of good to hide their bad. And I'm not sure what they're doing bad, but some people say they are bad. My ex-father-in-law reached 33rd degree Mason, which is as high as you can go. It is the final step. And the 33rd degree Mason, when he came back from it, and he didn't tell me, he wouldn't tell me this, his wife told me, but she said the night he came back from the ceremony, she said, I wasn't invited. It was just he and some upper level Masons, and they put him in 33rd degree. He came back and took off his apron and said, I'm never going back. And she said, why? He said, you won't believe what I found out tonight. He said, everything I've done with the Masons led to that, and it's the total opposite of what I believe. And that got a little scary, because when he died, I was at the funeral, and the Masons came. They said, we want to perform our ritual. And the wife said, no. She said, he did not want to have anything to do with you guys. And they said, he's 33rd degree. She said, he didn't like it. She said, I don't know what it is, but they said, well, they had this big, long talk, and the funeral director was Mason. And so he talked her into it. So they made us all leave. The body's in the viewing room. Everybody had to get out, family and everybody. Masons went in, closed the doors, and they were in there for a few minutes. And when we came back, he was wearing his apron, his Masonic ring, had some evergreen on his chest. They had done some ritual, and she let him be buried. So the verdict's out on the Masons, because I know a lot of people that are Masons are good people, and they do good things, but something on that top tier scared him. And a lot of it had to do, well, she did say that he said they're worshiping Satan. They just don't call it that. I said, well, they're doing it in an odd way. But that's what he's talking about here. Now, I got 1 minute. Let me give you the kicker. What Paul tells us to do in Colossians, and I'm going to do more of this because he talks again. But look at chapter 3. He says, if then you have been raised with Christ, seek the things that are above, where Christ is seated at the right hand of God. So in other words, he's saying we've got to get the mysteries and the fullness, which is Christ, the hidden treasures and wisdom in chapter 2. And now in chapter 3, he's telling us why. And here it is, verse 2. Set your minds on things that are above, not on things of the earth, for you have died, and your life is hidden with Christ in God. Now, there's another verse, and I'm going to jump to it right fast if I can find it. 1 John 2:5, I think is the one I was looking for. Maybe it's not. No, that's not the one I'm thinking about. Okay. It's 1 John 2:15 where it says, do not love the world or things of the world, for if anyone loves the world, the love of the Father is not in him. For all that is in the world, the desires of the flesh, desires of the eyes, and pride of life is not from the Father, but from the world. And the world is passing away along with its desires, but whoever does the will of God abides forever. What he's saying there, and I wish he'd put them all in one book, but you link this together, and what Paul is saying is you got to put your mind on the things that are above, because jumping over to 1 John, if you're focused on the desires, and it can be the desires of the flesh, desires of the eyes, the pride. All of this is the world. And he has a very logical statement here. He's basically saying, if your life is about the desires of this world, and honestly, our lives are about the desires of this world. We may not admit it, but we do it. But if that's what our total focus, then all of that's going to die. And when it dies, part of us dies with it. Yeah, the old saying about you can't take it with you. Now, I know some rich people that are good Christians, and I have no doubt about their salvation, because you know what? They're rich. They have 2 beach houses, but they'd give it up in a heartbeat for Christ. I know some people that are rich that if you take away anything, they're just devastated. And their whole goal is to get more. And I'm not saying rich people are bad, that 1%, the evil 1%, all you hear about on the news, they pay more taxes than anybody, but that's another thing. I'm just simply saying that not everybody is the same. Just because you're wealthy doesn't make you evil. Just because you have fulfilled the desires of nice house, nice car, lots of money, stuff like that, doesn't mean you're a slave to it. But Jesus warns us, he said, be careful, because you can't serve 2 gods. You can't serve God and mammon being wealth. But if you're not tied to it, it's okay. Because I've known some very good, rich Christians who are very philanthropic. They use their money to help and do all kinds of stuff. I'd love to be rich. Debbie and I were talking, we always play this game. She said, what if we played the lottery and we won? What would we do with the money? And I sat there and I said, I know you and you know me. We'd probably give it away. She laughed. She said, we would. We'd give it to people who need it. But only people who need it. We're not going to give it to bad people. But Paul is saying that it's a priority thing. And like I said, I'm going to stop this today, but this is where we're going the next couple of weeks. Priority. Set your mind and your sights on Christ. Everything else is secondary. And when it becomes primary, then you've made a mistake. And that's what we've got to do to prepare ourselves to meet God. We have to be looking forward to meeting God. I know some people that, think about meeting God, they say, well, I don't know. I said, well, you better figure it out, because it would be great to meet God. You go to a hospice sometime, and it's interesting. It's not pleasant. But sometimes it is, because in a hospice you'll meet people that aren't ready to meet God, and they're crying, they're screaming, they don't want to die. But occasionally you'll meet somebody who's smiling and at peace and saying, I'm so looking forward to this. And you think, that's who I want to be when the time comes. I've gone over as usual. Let me have a word of prayer, and I'll let you go. Heavenly Father, we thank you for this opportunity to come and share your word, to study. Bless us, Lord, be with us and help us, give us reason and understanding. We have lifted up our friends and loved ones in prayer, and we pray, God, you bless them, be with them, give them quick healing so that they can return to us. And Lord, as I always say, forgive us of our weaknesses. We are insignificant in the mind of God, and yet you made us significant with your love and your grace. And we thank you, and we cannot praise you enough for your actions toward us. Evil as we are, you loved us while we were sinners. So Lord, now the goal is to help us to be the people you want us to be. In Jesus' name I pray. Amen.
Thank you.
I forgot to ask one question, where this went when I finished. So I will hand it back
Thanks,
to
too late
you.
now.